Hello, and welcome to Principles of Macroeconomics. This is Module 5.2, and in this series, we're going to be talking about the Phillips curve. So if we recall from our last video, we were talking about how government policies can affect the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. The two goals that the government has in mind when it is trying to affect the aggregate economy are first to try to promote growth or decrease unemployment, and secondly, to try to control or curb inflation. Now, what we're going to learn in this segment, and what I've hinted at already in the last segment, is that the government can't do both at the same time. And we're going to explore exactly this relationship between inflation and unemployment in this video. The Phillips curve illustrates the relationship between inflation and unemployment. In the long run, the Phillips curve is a vertical line because the unemployment rate in the long run is going to be dictated by the natural rate of unemployment. Therefore, in the long run, it doesn't matter what the inflation rate of the economy is. The unemployment rate is going to be dictated by frictional and structural factors. On the other hand, in the short run, we have a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment, telling us that we have to choose between high inflation and low unemployment, or low inflation and high unemployment. Remember, the distinction between long run and short run comes from the fact of classical dichotomy. In the long run, classical dichotomy holds, and we have a separation between nominal and real variables. On the other hand, in the short run, nominal and real variables are more closely intertwined, and the classical dichotomy breaks down. So, the Phillips curve, especially in the short run, is going to provide policymakers with an idea of the trade-offs that they face when they choose the various government policies and choose reactions and interventions to stabilize the economy. So let's look at an example here. Let's consider a situation where we have expansionary monetary policy. As you can see, to describe this example of the Phillips curve, we're going to use three different markets. The first is going to be the money demand and money supply market. The second is going to be the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. And third, we're going to also include the Phillips curve. So let's assume that we have expansionary monetary policy. We've already discussed this in the past videos, so it should be a nice reminder of what we had talked about in the past. So we see expansion of the money supply. The money supply curve shifts out or to the right. We see a downward pressure on the interest rate. The result is that we have an increase in aggregate demand. Aggregate demand curve shifts out. The result is that the price level rises and output rises. As output rises, this tells us that unemployment is going to fall. More people are employed, we're producing more. On the other hand, with this increase in the price, in the short run economic fluctuation, this is indicative of higher inflation. So that we move on our Phillips curve from a point such as point A to a point such as point B. At point A, we have lower inflation, higher unemployment. At point B, we have higher inflation and lower unemployment. So now let's think about a negative supply shock and the indication of what could happen with government policies trying to stabilize the negative effects of a supply shock. So remember, if we have a negative supply shock, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts in or to the left, yielding higher prices and lower output. This is indicative of the fact that we have higher inflation and higher unemployment. This is going to cause a shift out of the Phillips curve so that we move from a point such as point A to a point such as point B on the short-run Phillips curve. So what is the government going to do? Remember, they can either choose to control inflation or to lower unemployment. If they try to curb inflation through contractionary monetary policy, this results in a decrease in the aggregate demand. We move to a short-run equilibrium such as point C. This is going to be a movement along the Phillips curve from point B to point C. So we've had the negative supply shock, yielding a shift out of the short-run Phillips curve, but because of the stabilization policy to try to curb inflation, we move along the Phillips curve to a new point of lower inflation, but at the cost of higher unemployment. Now, if we try to curb the higher unemployment rates, the aggregate demand curve is going to have to shift out or to the right, expansionary monetary policy or expansionary fiscal policy. This is going to cause a movement along the Phillips curve, now from point B to the new point C. The result is higher inflation, but more growth, greater output, and therefore lower unemployment. So as you can see with the Phillips curve, we use the Phillips curve to indicate the trade-offs that government policymakers face when they are trying to conduct stabilization policies. They can't both lower inflation and lower unemployment. They need to make a choice. Which is more important, lower inflation or lower employment? What do you think? So in this video, we've talked about specifically how we can link government policies and their effects on the aggregate economy with the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve gives us the trade-off that policymakers face between inflation and unemployment. Through the changes in aggregate demand and through fiscal and monetary policy, government policymakers cannot both lower inflation and lower unemployment. They're faced with a choice. What is more important, lower inflation or lower unemployment? Thanks so much for joining me in Module 5.2.